The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. Welcome back to the Berean Pursuit. This is week 46, day 3. Today we're reading Daniel chapters 4 through 6 and John chapter 18. Last time in Daniel we began the book and we saw that Daniel and his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were taken into captivity in Babylon. This was the first captivity from Judah, and they were trained for 3 years in the court of the king and taught to speak the language of the Chaldeans as well as read their literature and become well-versed in their culture so that they could help govern that nation, as well as help with the Jews that were being taken there as part of their kingdom now, part of this empire. So we saw that they were appointed to high positions. Daniel was one who interpreted a dream. In fact, he told the dream to Nebuchadnezzar, and then he interpreted it for him because God gave him the interpretation. And it was about the kingdom that would come. And in that dream, he saw that there were these 4 different kingdoms: the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And they were not all named in that dream. They're going to be named, at least some of them will be named in later visions that Daniel has. But the focus is that God's kingdom will last forever, whereas the kingdoms of men do not. And Nebuchadnezzar was learning that God is one who can reveal mysteries. Then we saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not kneeling down to worship the statue that Nebuchadnezzar made. And so they were thrown into the fiery furnace, and they were not harmed. There was one in there with them who looked like a son of the gods or an angel. And then they were brought out, and Nebuchadnezzar then came to learn that their God was one who had power to save and rescue people out of anything. He could do great things. And so he made a decree that anyone who spoke against their God would be killed, cut into pieces, and his house would be destroyed. And so that's where we are in our reading. Let's continue in Daniel chapters 4 through 6. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the people of every nation and language who dwell in all the earth, may your prosperity be multiplied. I am pleased to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I had a dream, and it frightened me, while in my bed the images and visions in my mind alarmed me. So I issued a decree that all the wise men of Babylon be brought before me to interpret the dream for me. When the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners came in, I told them the dream, and they could not interpret it for me. But at last into my presence came Daniel, whose name is Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery baffles you. So explain to me the visions I saw in my dream and their interpretation. In these visions of my mind, as I was lying in bed, I saw this come to pass. There was a tree in the midst of the land, and its height was great. The tree grew large and strong, its top reached the sky, and it was visible to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit was abundant, and upon it was food for all. Under it the beasts of the field found shelter. In its branches the birds of the air nested, and from it every creature was fed. As I lay on my bed, I also saw in the visions of my mind a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven. He called out in a loud voice, "Cut down the tree and chop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump with its roots in the ground and a band of iron and bronze around it in the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and graze with the beasts on the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from that of a man, and let him be given the mind of a beast till 7 times pass him by. This decision is the decree of the watchers, the verdict declared by the holy ones, so that the living will know that the Most High rules over the kingdom of mankind and gives it to whom he wishes, setting over it the lowliest of men. This is the dream that I, King Nebuchadnezzar, saw. Now, Belteshazzar, tell me the interpretation, because none of the wise men of my kingdom can interpret it for me. But you are able, because the spirit of the holy gods is in you. For a time, Daniel, who was also known as Belteshazzar, was perplexed, and his thoughts alarmed him. So the king said, "Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation alarm you." "My lord," replied Belteshazzar, "may the dream apply to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your enemies. The tree you saw that grew large and strong, whose top reached the sky and was visible to all the earth, whose foliage was beautiful and whose fruit was abundant, providing food for all, under which the beasts of the field lived and in whose branches the birds of the air nested, you, O king, are that tree. For you have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown to reach the sky, and your dominion extends to the ends of the earth. And you, O king, saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, 'Cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump with its roots in the ground, and a band of iron and bronze around it in the tender grass of the field. Let him be drenched with the dew of heaven and graze with the beasts of the field till 7 times pass him by.' This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree that the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You will be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling will be with the beasts of the field. You will feed on grass like an ox, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass you by, until you acknowledge that the Most High rules over the kingdom of mankind and gives it to whom he wishes. As for the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots, your kingdom will be restored to you as soon as you acknowledge that heaven rules. Therefore, may my advice be pleasing to you, O king. Break away from your sins by doing what is right, and from your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed. Perhaps there will be an extension of your prosperity." All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar 12 months later. As he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, the king exclaimed, "Is this not Babylon the Great, which I myself have built by the might of my power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. "It is decreed to you, King Nebuchadnezzar, that the kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven away from mankind to live with the beasts of the field, and you will feed on grass like an ox. And 7 times will pass you by until you acknowledge that the Most High rules over the kingdom of mankind and gives it to whom he wishes." At that moment, the sentence against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from mankind. He ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity was restored to me. Then I praised the Most High, and I honored and glorified him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does as he pleases with the army of heaven and the peoples of the earth. There is no one who can restrain his hand or say to him, 'What have you done?' At the same time, my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisers and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne, and surpassing greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and all his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." Later, King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he drank wine with them. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king could drink from them, along with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. Thus they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king drank from them, along with his nobles, his wives, and his concubines. As they drank the wine, they praised their gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. At that moment, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face grew pale, and his thoughts so alarmed him that his hips gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought in, and he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this inscription and tells me its interpretation will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." So all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or interpret it for him. Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified, his face grew even more pale, and his nobles were bewildered. Hearing the outcry of the king and his nobles, the queen entered the banquet hall. "O king, may you live forever," she said. "Do not let your thoughts terrify you or your face grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your father, he was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Your own father, the king, did this because Daniel, the one he named Belteshazzar, was found to have an extraordinary spirit, as well as knowledge, understanding, and the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Summon Daniel, therefore, and he will give you the interpretation." So Daniel was brought before the king, who asked him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom." Now the wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this inscription and interpret it for me, but they could not give its interpretation. But I have heard about you that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Therefore, if you can read this inscription and give me its interpretation, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." In response, Daniel said to the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the inscription for the king and interpret it for him. As for you, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness, glory and honor. Because of the greatness that he bestowed on him, the people of every nation and language trembled in fear before him. He killed whom he wished and kept alive whom he wished. He exalted whom he wished and humbled whom he wished. But when his heart became arrogant and his spirit was hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven away from mankind, and his mind was like that of a beast. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God rules over the kingdom of mankind, setting over it whom he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Instead, you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels from his house were brought to you, and as you drank wine from them with your nobles, wines, and concubines, you praised your gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you have failed to glorify the God who holds in his hand your very breath and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Now this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez means that your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and they clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, and proclaimed him the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. Now it pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel, to whom these satraps were accountable so that the king would not suffer loss. Soon, by his extraordinary spirit, Daniel distinguished himself among the administrators and satraps. So the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Thus the administrators and satraps sought a charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or corruption because he was trustworthy and no negligence or corruption was found in him. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." So the administrators and satraps went together to the king and said, "O King Darius, may you live forever. All the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce a decree that for 30 days anyone who petitions any god or man except you, O king, will be thrown into the den of lions. Therefore, O king, establish the decree and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed." Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, he went into his house where the windows of his upper room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. So they approached the king and asked about his royal decree. "Did you not sign a decree that for 30 days any man who petitions any god or man except you, O king, will be thrown into the den of lions?" The king replied, "According to the law of the Medes and Persians, the order stands and it cannot be repealed." Then they told the king, "Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, shows no regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you have signed. He still makes his petition 3 times a day." As soon as the king heard this, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and he labored until sundown to rescue him. Then the men approached the king together and said to him, "Remember, O king, that by the law of the Medes and Persians no decree or ordinance established by the king can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the den of lions. The king said to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, And the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that nothing concerning Daniel could be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and sleep fled from him. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the den of lions. When he reached the den, he cried out in a voice of anguish, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel replied, "O king, may you live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, for I was found innocent in his sight, and I have done no wrong against you, O king." The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted out of the den, no wounds whatsoever were found on him, because he had trusted in his God. At the command of the king, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions, they and their children and wives. And before they had reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to the people of every nation and language throughout the land, "May your prosperity abound. I hereby decree that in every part of my kingdom men are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He delivers and rescues. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Now to the New Testament in John chapter 18. Last time in John, in chapter 17, we saw the prayer that Jesus prayed, where he was asking God to glorify him so he can glorify the Father. He's talking about the unity that they have together and praying for unity among his followers, for the apostles, that God would protect them, but also that those that would come from them or believe through their testimony would also have unity, and that would demonstrate who Jesus is, that he was truly sent by the Father. And so that's where we are. We've gotten through the conversation Jesus had with his disciples that night, through this prayer that he prays as they're traveling towards the garden. And now we're ready for John chapter 18. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where they entered a garden. Now Judas, his betrayer, also knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a band of soldiers and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. They arrived at the garden carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was coming upon him, stepped forward and asked them, "Whom are you seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. Jesus said, "I am he." And Judas, his betrayer, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they answered. "I told you that I am he," Jesus replied. "So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word he had spoken, "I have not lost one of those you have given me." Then Simon Peter drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. "Put your sword back in its sheath," Jesus said to Peter. "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the band of soldiers with its commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. They brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be better if one man died for the people. Now Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he also went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. Then the disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. At this, the servant girl watching the door said to Peter, "Aren't you also one of this man's disciples?" "I am not," he answered. Because it was cold, the servants and officers were standing around a charcoal fire they had made to keep warm, and Peter was also standing with them warming himself. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus answered. "I always taught in the synagogues and at the temple, where all the Jews came together. I said nothing in secret. Why are you asking me? Ask those who heard my message. Surely they know what I said." When Jesus had said this, one of the officers standing nearby slapped him in the face and said, "Is this how you answer the high priest?" Jesus replied, "If I said something wrong, testify as to what was wrong. But if I spoke correctly, why did you strike me?" Then Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Simon Peter was still standing and warming himself, so they asked him, "Aren't you also one of his disciples?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" Peter denied it once more, and immediately a rooster crowed. Then they led Jesus away from Caiaphas into the praetorium. By now it was early morning, and the Jews did not enter the praetorium to avoid being defiled and unable to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and asked, "What accusation are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." "You take him and judge him by your own law," Pilate told them. "We are not permitted to execute anyone," the Jews replied. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to indicate the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate went back into the praetorium, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Are you saying this on your own?" Jesus asked, "or did others tell you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is not of this realm." "Then you are a king," Pilate said. "You say that I am a king," Jesus answered. "For this reason I was born and have come into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. And having said this, he went out again to the Jews and told them, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom that I release to you one prisoner at the Passover. So then, do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" "Not this man," they shouted, "but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was an insurrectionist. All right, in our reading today in Daniel, we started off with a chapter that's actually written by Nebuchadnezzar. It's written in Aramaic, the language that he would have spoken, and it is from his perspective. So this is one place where a Gentile wrote part of the Bible, but he is writing it from the perspective of a king who had sinned against God through pride, whom God had humbled, and now he's declaring to everyone how great God is and how just God is, and he is able to humble those that are proud. And he rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. And then we saw the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and he does not learn from what happened to his father. So he exalts himself against the God of heaven by taking the things meant for worshiping God and using it to drink his alcohol with his wives and concubines and so on, and praise the idols that he worships. And so God has this finger, this human hand right on the wall, and nobody can interpret it for him until his mother, the queen, I believe this is his mother, comes in and tells him that Daniel is one who can do this. So Daniel comes, he interprets it, and King Belshazzar dies that night, and the Medes and the Persians take over from the Babylonians. So this was something that was prophesied in that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. The head of gold would be followed by the silver, which represented the Medes and the Persians, and now they are ruling. And Darius the Mede took over as the king of Babylon. He's under Cyrus. Cyrus conquers the city of Babylon, and he establishes Darius as the king there in Babylon. But he would later on come and be the king as well. So Cyrus is king at this time, but Darius is king under him. At least that's how I understand how it all worked together. But Darius is ruling as king there in Babylon, and he wants to appoint Daniel as head over everything. And those that are corrupt do not want Daniel ruling over everything because he's not corrupt. And so they try to find something against him, and so they have to come up with something that's related to the law of his God, and they end up saying he cannot pray. And they convince the king to make this foolish law, and then they catch Daniel praying. Daniel wasn't trying to hide it, and they brought him to the king. The king could not do anything about it because even though he's king, once a law was signed, he could not change it. So they have to throw Daniel into the lion's den. Now, we often think of Daniel. He's often pictured as a young man, but he's not young at this point. This is close to 70 years after he's taken into captivity. Not quite 70 years, maybe 60 years. But if he was 15 when he was taken, he'll be in his 70s at least when he is put into the lion's den. But God protects him, and there's not a scratch on him when he comes out. The men that are thrown in after him, their bones are broken before they even reach the bottom of the den. So it's clear that God was the one protecting Daniel, and it wasn't something to do with the lions just weren't biting that day. So Darius made the decree that all must worship the God of Daniel, or at least respect the God of Daniel, because he's the only God who can deliver like that. So during this time, God is making his name known among the nations, not just in Israel, but he's becoming known throughout the world. And it's becoming clear to even the rulers how great God is. Then in John 18, we read about Jesus going into the garden, meeting the crowd that Judas led there, and protecting his disciples, but allowing himself to be arrested. Even when Peter tried to fight to defend him, he stopped him. Now, it's not mentioned here in John, but we know from other Gospels that he actually heals the ear of the man that was cut off. So Jesus is taken, and Peter and another disciple follow. That other disciple is able to get in because he's known there, but he allows Peter to get in, and then Peter ends up being accused of being a disciple of Jesus, and rather than following through with his commitment to die with the Lord if necessary, he denies him, just as Jesus told him he would, and he did it 3 times, just as Jesus said he would. Well, they give Jesus a trial, not a fair trial, but a trial, and then they take him to Pilate and tell him that they want Jesus executed, and it says that that was to indicate what kind of death Jesus would die. Jesus had said he would be lifted up, and only the Romans killed through crucifixion. So if the Romans are executing him, he's going to die through crucifixion. And so Pilate interviews him to try to find out why he should be killed. And he finds nothing wrong with Jesus. Jesus is an innocent man. There's nothing wrong there. But Pilate asks, well, do you want me to release the King of the Jews? And it seems like he thinks that the crowd will want Jesus to be released, and then he can go ahead and execute all the real criminals instead of releasing one of them. But rather, they said to release Barabbas, who was a true criminal, an insurrectionist. We know from other Gospels that he was a murderer and he was not a good man. But they requested his release rather than the innocent one, Jesus. And so Pilate is not going to be happy with this, but he will end up going ahead and following what the crowd wants. But we'll read that next time. Well, that is the reading for today. Join me again tomorrow as, Lord willing, we will continue with the Berean pursuit.